Hello everyone, today we talk about Magyar warfare that we are no strangers to, but that we've never really dealt with as far as evidential military history is concerned, campaign after campaign. This is an arduous task considering obviously the vast history of the Magyars, especially during the period of the second invasions. There were countless, as a matter of fact, raids across Europe, mostly Central Europe, but pretty much all the west and in the south of Europe at some point were reached by Magyar incursions in the continent. This is a very interesting historical point because the question is also like we're telling the history of this, but where's the limit? Where do we draw the line in terms of telling the story and possibly expanding it through more research? Obviously, these videos, as you understand, are basically some compendia that we make out of sort of for sake of completion. Firstly, then I'm, for example, thinking already at talking more in depth about Magyar, say, Bulgarian warfare, for example, interactions with other peoples. We made last year a video about the Battle of Riade, interestingly enough. So we're entering a bit more into the depths of the actual practice of the Magyar art of war, and the picture wouldn't be complete if we didn't list overall all these encounters and didn't also try to criticize sort of their meaning, right? To find a general narrative, a general map that can allow sort of further access and approach, right? It would be really interesting to expand in the same way for as far as the Vikings, the Saracens are concerned as well, because as you know, these powers were acting, if not in direct concert with one another, even though there were surely, sort of, in this case, Norse war bands that participated to Magyar raids at some point. But there is a broader picture, in fact, that is to say why the second invasions actually happened, and how was continental Europe reacting to this as well. And for today, we will have to observe this. We will stick mostly from the Magyar side of the Magyar side of the aisle. Nevertheless, it's obvious that when you talk about military history, you have necessarily to look at this as a duel, as a confrontation between two sides, and explaining why were the Magyars so successful. Because normally when I deal with the second invasions, on top of all what we've seen in this post-Carolingian context, and I have an entire playlist dedicated to that, also one about seigneurial Europe that more or less deals with this sort of, you can check the high medieval history as well. Like it's one of, in my opinion, the most underrated periods in European history, and it is very often misunderstood as some sort of mere period, especially as far as the immediate post-Carolingian period is concerned, as a mere crisis that is not promptly explained, that is, as all the concept of crisis, it's not like the crisis did not exist, but the question is by which degree are we assessing that, like in relation to which polities, for which institutions, and for which reasons, right? And we observed how not just post-Carolingian kingdoms, together with the same idea of the empire, remained fundamentally there, and Latin Germanic Europe basically went on. So say Franco-Roman Europe, if we want to be more precise in some terminology, went on and was able to lay the further foundations, because there were also previous foundations for that matter sort of erecting. In fact, an encapsulated society, for example, what we mostly consider down the line as the so-called feudal one, and in fact, an incredible universal imperial capacity coming back. That as a explanation, or at least as a description, already tells us that even if this did not happen out of the blue, and especially could not happen simply after a good century of just plain beating at the hands of the Scandinavians, of the Magyars, of the Saracens. There must have been something behind that, if we know how strongly Europe sort of sprang out back and was able actually to largely not just defeat and put an end to this incursion, but also to Christianize a large part of it, if not the majority of these peoples, especially the European ones, but also the Crusades witnessed, also the Reconquista, etc. A massive comeback against Islam, which also happened just in the subsequent centuries. So that's a completely different topic that I addressed here and there, especially in the videos about the Saracens. But the most obvious sort of pattern that normally fits this the explanation that is in fact also historiographically sort of settled by this point is that the so-called second invasions as a whole were possible, not much because these peoples were any sort of particular sort of terrifying war machines or civilizationally scaled powers that could fundamentally destroy the West or whatever, but simply because the West sort of allowed this in the sense that it was so politically fragmented, but at the same time self-confident about its own resources, that at some point allowed, and this is very well also not just historically but historiographically documented, to first of all use these second invaders in their own petty clashes. I mean, it's notorious that in the late Carolingian era, say East and West Francia threw Vikings at one another, that especially in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, the Magyars were able to cross and getting as far as Gaul, simply because the local noblemen said, okay, well, go through, as long as you don't plunder here, right? Even though they did also plunder, at least in many areas that were, for the same Eastern Frankish political reasons, often about a local nobility that did not want royal power to concentrate and arriving to the point in which the system, the thing was unsustainable objectively and risked destabilizing, in fact, Saxony, Thuringia, Bavaria. And so there was a massive coming back with the Germans essentially entrusting power to the Ottonians that crushed the Magyars once for all, and not because there hadn't been Magyar defeats here and there. We tend sort of to underestimate how they had taken a beating already. Like, first of all, in attritional warfare against the Bavarians from a long time, Ariade is probably sort of not underrated because, say, everybody more or less knows what that was. But let's say compared to Lechfeld was just more like a point of arrival rather than a start of a proper defeat of the Magyars that temporarily turn, as we'll see today, as it's notorious, against the Byzantines, and eventually tend to settle down by being stunned by the German model that will also try at some point to subsume them, as we've seen in some videos about the later German campaigns aimed at integrating Hungary into the whole Roman Empire, which would succeed only for Bohemia, but not in fact for the Magyars or Poland. They get Christianized, they get settled down, they get Westernized, and so on. We made lots of videos about later Hungarian warfare. It's really interesting, and we'll make more about it. The Magyars had been beaten here and there in Burgundy, for example, by the Longobards in southern Italy. There had been different cases in which we realized that once these guys were sort of encountering a more stable and cohesive political situation, they basically could not get through. It's just like, I don't know, the Saracens in southern Italy. They were essentially hired as mercenaries by the local Longobard principalities. We've seen it also recently in the live stream I participated to with Eastern Roman history. The same goes for the Norse. They at some point exploit Western Frankish instability due to the fact that local noblemen wanted simply to autonomize, and even allow the Vikings to swarm through in some areas to eventually accuse the monarchy of being impotent, which paradoxically actually strengthened the monarchy because other parts of this vast territory still said, but those noblemen are wicked enough to do this, so let's actually give more power to the monarchy. And after, in fact, the descent got fortified with different bridges, etc., as you know, the Great Host, and there is a stepping up also in the scale of Norse expeditions, turns mostly towards England. That was an easier target, telling the truth, and we'll get there also better in some campaigns. So the Magyars are really interesting because they pertain not just to a Central European dimension as far as sort of in the best of invaders, not only telling the truth as invaders, but they have a very importantly different background for most also steppe peoples. We look at all the various steppe peoples that settled in Europe at some point. The Magyars are basically the only Ugro-Finnic people, and they maintain especially because there is all history during their migration from east of the Urals, basically, with a broader Middle Eastern civilization, mostly Persia, and from there, actually, with the access of the Caliphate, etc. And we noticed that their way of war, while, of course, we are in the High Middle Ages, and it's sort of all fairly primitive and rough, obviously, the steppe, the Magyars were not a steppe people originally, as you know, they came from the forest, but eventually they are just mixed in part with some steppe elements, but they, by getting on the move, as bit as it had happened with the Germans during the Völkerwanderung, in fact, they required some sort of Reitervölker kind of Reitervolk physiognomy, so to say. Nevertheless, the explanation that we provided in terms of, but so these peoples were successful uniquely because the West was weak, and so they could, every people could have done that. Well, there is a degree of truth to this, because in any case, the level of development of different polities was measured in ways that the Magyars were naturally more primitive than the Eastern Franks, say, but they were not as distant as sort of with other peoples as well. Say the Italics were different, for example. There were sort of different degrees of effectiveness, in fact, of the second invaders, depending on the societies, the territories that they came to strike. But this explanation also does not render justice to the actual and impressive effectiveness of the Magyar armies at this point in history. They are striking level of success. If you just count properly all the various expeditions that we are aware of, and you sort of assess them on the basis of their scale, so we realize that most Magyar raids were incredibly successful. And even though, of course, like in every military context, they took a beating here and there, eventually they were defeated for good, so to say, in this raiding lifestyle. So that was a big game changer for them, and a great victory, obviously, for the whole Roman Empire. There is, and this brings to great civilizational changes in Europe, in the sort of the Pannonian plain, the Carpathian Basin, and so on. Indeed, looking at Magyar armies is quite fascinating, and it does definitely appear that these hosts were not just a pack of primitive barbarians, right? All the various waves of nomads that at some point settled in Europe had sort of different level of actual military quality. The Huns, for example, in comparison to their sort of historical and cultural or even pop cultural ego, they're probably overrated, right? The Avars are, in this sense, probably underrated on the same ground. When you look at the Magyars, you see something extremely interesting, and in fact, more effective, probably here, surely possibly underrated, but that must still be properly framed in also an accurate vision. This is not a matter of partisan feeling towards them. This is properly being able to assess their effectiveness as armies. I made multiple videos about Magyar tactics as well, so if you're interested in how they operated, there was a typical steppe way of war. Plundering, this is something that continues, that had already happened, of course, with other steppes peoples, but if you look even at, the Ottoman invasions of Hungary or Austria in the early modern age, you realize that, paradoxically, even though the Ottomans destroyed the Hungarians down the line, they fought in similar ways. There was essentially a core army that had some sort of heavy component. The steppe peoples often and typically had sort of very good elite, but say with normally insufficient numbers to deliver the final decisive blow to the core of Western armies that were heavier, bulkier, less mobile, but in this sense probably more courageous. We can see it also with the Mongols that also defeated at that point in the 13th century the much more westernized Magyar army. And for this reason, the steppe peoples have to rely on some sort of antenna, some sort of screen, essentially different scouting, raiding, foraging parties at literally 1 day of march away from the core. So normally 30 kilometers, as you know, which was pretty standard throughout most of the military. So it's really what you can't cover as a properly trained force in a day, and you can actually do even more than double, right? And it would be interesting to make a video exactly about this. Cavalry did not even matter over infantry that much in a broader strategic sense. Tactically, yes, it made some differences that, as you know, and I commented on this also concerning the work of other channels, that there's this massive sort of orientalistic, in contemporary reconstructionism, massive orientalistic bias in favor of ranged weapons and technologism in general. And the reason why actually these peoples fought like this is that they perfectly knew that if we were caught in the open by heavier armies, they were done for, right? So the idea of having this screen around, of day of march, giving properly the time for the corps with the nobility, the camp, all the wagons, everything that they brought with them in terms of wealth, because if the leaders, if the grand princes traveled in the expedition, obviously they brought also the riches, etc., had to get the hell out of there in time. All right, and yet this exactly because these forces had mostly a plundering objective. They didn't have to conquer other places. They just were in for the loot, also indicating that they were in fact incapable of launching any sustained sort of territorial conquest outside of, in fact, tributary demands to more fragmented Slavic and other ethnicity, sort of ethnic tribes around them, as they were based in the steppes, as a matter of fact, in the Pannonian steppes themselves, maintaining their pastures, their way of life for generations, in order to continue probably also this model of army, because horse archery, mounted combat in general, required also that lifestyle to be sustained, that in fact ends when the raids end, right, when they take the beating and they Christianize in the second half of the 10th century, the beginning of the 11th. They are basically declaring, we don't have the capacity to do anything else but passing by and eventually coming back. And so this actually creates less of a problem to the local leaders in the Latin Germanic West than, in fact, they mostly pose to one another in the continuous struggles for the post-Carolingian kingdom's stabilization, with different provincial bases that were very much hit by the same Magyars and Saracens and Vikings and so on, but that ultimately remained there. They were more stable, they were richer, more powerful, and in fact, at the end of the day, prevailed without any exception anywhere in this sense. So this is the overall background that we have delineated during the years, which makes a lot of sense. But in this sense, we have to understand that Magyar expeditions were still a heavy structural damage, especially to certain parts of Europe. They were in this sense effective, and they continue, in fact, for so long to require great effort to being stopped and to eventually cause a much deeper change of, say, Magyar society. Right? They say the Magyars were much hungrier than their counterparts, all right, in the West. So they were probably more pressed to do so than the Westerners were to simply fence them off and to invest considerable political, even before sort of military, in this sense also material, military power and material resources to stop. All right, in all of this, in a period that is universally known for encapsulation in Europe, that, as historiography has long demonstrated, was not much a matter of second invaders, right? The proliferation of castles all across the post-Carolingian kingdom, this happens also elsewhere, right? Even the Magyars had some forms of encapsulation. We've seen it for the Khazars, etc. Is mostly, in fact, a political change. It's one of oligarchization, privatization, and so on. But these castles spread pretty much everywhere, right? If you look at the known raids at large, the more important one, you realize that, yes, some places were hit, maybe even once, twice, thrice, especially like the great riverways of Gaul, etc. And different regions in Germany were crossed by the Magyars for a very long time. The Magyars were a very menacing presence. They sort of thought of themselves at some point as the lords of the Eastern Franks, even though, of course, this was more like, wishful thinking. It's a bit like the Bulgarians thinking that there were Tsars, Roman emperors, because they could sort of annoy and sort of there was the looming threat on Constantinople, right? But indeed, when you look at where castles spread in a general basis, like you realize that some places were hit maybe just once, some places were never hit, and there were castles everywhere, right? And this mostly, and there are actually some areas where actually the center of encapsulation in Europe starts probably around Rome, and to spread further north in the following generations and centuries, exactly after the Saracen raids had halted. Like in the moment this had stopped, basically the local Roman noblemen start building enough castles to probably organize a territorial dominion. And it's true actually that castles were appearing here and there pretty much everywhere, but this also happens because we can already trace a level of development and resources, etc., that was already contained in the heat probably of the second invasions. Most of we know of castles that were properly built in order to stop the second invaders. They were mostly peripheral castles built on passes and places that normally would have not really played this great role, because the most important castles were in the fertile lowlands, right, to dominate the population, protecting it as well against raids in certain circumstances, but mostly from the local neighbors, not much these foreigners that showed up frequently in some places, but also really once in a while, or rarely or never in others. There would be so many considerations to make about the Magyars, but given that we are sort of appreciating their military history, let's probably get a bit into it, a bit also in their mythology, because as you know, there is all a sort of proto-history of their leadership, in particular how they had formed as a people and how power was held, which is something that we mostly get from the later Hungarian traditions that were tendentially, as we've seen in the probably later Middle Ages, emphasizing the importance of the ethnic nobility against the interferences of the monarchs. This will actually bring not just Hungary, but basically all Central European monarchies to be failed states by the end of the Middle Ages. Nevertheless, they also stemmed from a specific sort of mentality that is definitely the typical authoritarian step one in many ways, that paradoxically, in fact, seems to emerge not much in places that are more functional in civilization, but in the most dysfunctional. And say these noblemen, to think about even the Polish Szlachta, they thought to be Sarmatians. Like this was this idea that these free lords of the steppes could maintain their sort of ancient customs of freedom, etc. They would have obviously accused their kings of tyranny for any attempt at power concentration, but obviously they had incredibly traumatic prerogatives in terms of their authority in their own oligarchic, in fact, provinces, oligarchically run provinces that even if you look at local society, definitely there is hardly the level of sort of stability and thriving, etc., than in other countries. Now, the Magyar tribes were sort of in this mythical past a confederation of 7 principal groups, known in Byzantine records as the Hetu-Mogr. And so practically the seven Magyars comprise, so this tells you also how they identified with their leaders. It's a very traditional concept, by the way, essentially a totemic fashion, comprising the tribes Nyek, Magyar, from which in fact the same ethnonym Magyar derives, and which held a leading position, because in fact they would end up being called like that also by different peoples. Tarjan, Jeno, Ker, Keshi, and Kürt-Gyarmat, whose names survive, in fact, in numerous Hungarian place names today, such as those incorporating the very same names and supplemented by 3 dissident Kabars, that is, rebel Khazar tribes, noted for their martial prowess and integration as allies, who served as vanguard and rearguard in joint operations, adding Turkic military expertise and possibly distinct subgroups to the federation. If you're interested in this and in the origins of the spaces when the Magyars at some point go at war even against the Khivans, during their migrations, also later telling the truth, but how the Khazars had created this massive Jewish Turkic empire. Actually, they had different religions at some point, but remember what I said about encapsulation. The Khazars had already been, creating a very interesting set of sanitary defenses along the major Eastern European riverways, especially the Volga. And this is, remember, the age of Viking incursions that are going to create essentially that Varangian force that will reinvigorate the Eastern Slavs, probably against the same Khazars, and in part their Magyar friends. I also made some videos about the Byzantine relations with the Khazars, etc., but we will come back on them too at some point. The Magyars had originated from the eastern Eurasian steppes with roots tracing to Finno-Ugric and Turkic admixtures before migrating westward. Of course, there were traces of Indo-Europeans. The migration era had sort of witnessed the sweeping of the Eurasian steppes by the Turks, and so many people become Turk, but they are also in great part descended from Indo-Europeans. We talked really a lot about this in many different videos. The Magyars at that point crossed into the Carpathian. So I'm skipping the whole origins because today we just look at known Magyar warfare in the more sort of straightforward second invasion timeline. They crossed into the Carpathian Basin during the closing years of the 9th century, specifically around 895-896. This process is called in Hungarian Önfoglalás, or land taking. This was not a sudden incursion, but the culmination of earlier displacements from the Pontic-Caspian steppe region called Ethelköts, meaning the literal land between the rivers, situated in the sense between the Dnipro and the Carpathians, where the Confederation had, in fact, we were in the southwest of the Pontic steppe, where the Confederation had coalesced after leaving earlier areas like Levedia. Driven by pressures from groups like the Pechenegs, including their Kangar subgroup, and Bulgarians in insane years, 894, 895, right? The Magyars at some point stood sort of at the Carpathian passes, ready to spring forth, depending on what sort of the international situation would have essentially told them, allowed them to do. This largely depended on sort of the Byzantine Empire, but also these different steppe peoples and others that had already settled in Europe, the Bulgarians, once the Bulgars having followed a similar pattern of the Magyars, but a bit before. There was always this policy of sort of creating problems, as the Magyars will to the Bulgarians, to those peoples at the frontier of the Byzantine Empire that disturbed, in fact, the Constantinople by injecting other steppe nomads that the Byzantines knew very well, having coped with them for a long time, never exhausting after one another. The Magyar movement built on prior probes, including an 862 entry into the basin at the request of Moravian leaders against East Frankish positions. Interestingly enough, this is, as you know, the Magyars will actually take place of the Avars, territorially speaking, because during the 9th century there had been a major void, right? The Carolingians had crushed under Charlemagne the Avar Khaganate, and at some point there was this big void in between. It was temporarily filled by the local Slavs connecting between the two Moravias, so to say, the one of proper today's Moravia and possibly the actual greater Moravia located roughly around today's Belgrade, right? And I made a video about the origins of the Serbs and sort of the great Moravian legion, so to say. In any case, the dominant forces were the Franks, and the Bulgarians that at some point came to clash against one another, in fact, in the Pannonian Plain, in the Carpathian Basin even, and it's a very interesting frontier that gets too few sort of attention in some ways. This was too much of a stretch effect for both powers involved, and the Magyars will end up settling exactly there. Under Arpad's direction, Arpad was the son of Almos, so you have the foundation probably of the Arpad dynasty that will last until the 14th century, with, in fact, its founder-elected chief of the confederation back in the day via the traditional shield-raising ritual that, as you know, was typical of actually all tribal cultures in Europe, with, since the beginning, also the Indo-Europeans, very strong steppe traditions in this regard. The migration era witnessed to a reactivation of the same, and these peoples in the High Middle Ages coming from the steppes still, in fact, did this on a regular basis. Still, in Europe, still kings were technically elected by the populus exercitus that consisted probably in this, the reenactment of this old ritual, but in much more formalized ways, right? Arpad would thus serve initially as military Gyula before assuming overarching leadership. Almash himself is traditionally viewed as the first head of the federation, possibly holding the sacral Kende role, and linked in legend to the mystical ancestress Emeshe, with the Magyar tribes securing footholds in the eastern plains before extending control westward. They encountered sparse local populations, remnants of earlier Avar dominance. As we were saying, the Avar Khaganate had controlled much of the Carpathian Basin from the late 6th century until its collapse under combined Frankish and Bulgarian pressures in the early 9th century, leaving behind archaeological traces of ring fortresses and a multi-ethnic subject population. There had been Germans. At this time, mostly the landscape had been Slavicized. The Huns had been there too. Different groups like the Longobards, the Ostrogoths had passed from there, ending up into Italy. And it's fair to say that this region was exhausted, at least probably this. It would be interesting to make a history of this territory due to the fact that it had been the center, so probably the receptacle of some of the greatest movements in inter-European history, since probably also the Indo-European migrations. But it also was the largest, and this is why this suited the nomads originally, the westernmost part of the Eurasian steppes, and therefore, as such, it had never really been a particularly developed place, and it would never really be in history, right? The same Romans treated Pannonia as a militarized frontier. There were nomadic peoples sort of circling around the Carpathian mountains, coming directly from the Pontic steppes, always sort of destabilizing this region. There was always a frontier, and heavily destructured from an infrastructural point of view. In general, there wasn't much to support like large amounts of people compared to Western Europe. And so it was, in any case, an apt place for the settlement of people like the Magyars, after all. There were enough resources for sustaining their previous way of war, and as we'll see now, to launch repeated raids into the richer, but at this point, disunited West. So they don't seem to have even had any particular problem in settling these places. They didn't meet any significant resistance. It's also likely that even though their neighbors later would not be particularly happy of their presence, especially the Slavs in the surrounding mountainous territories from Serbia to Slovakia and so on, the Magyar arrival did actually stabilize the situation for a while, but at a heavy price, but in fact allowing, as we'll see now, the same Western Slavs to actually launch raids themselves alongside the Magyars into the Eastern Frankish kingdom in particular. The Slavs were they couldn't oppose any sort of meaningful resistance. They remained more in the outskirts, in the mountains, in the forests, in the more sedentary areas. They had to pay tribute to the Magyars to join their military expeditions, and they sort of found themselves in between. there is always a distinctly separated, sort of more steppe, Magyar-looking area. We know from arms and armor, because these people were pre-Christian, so they would still bury their dead in arms. Whereas the Slavs were also gradually Christianizing, had a distinctly more sanitary culture. They were much more Germanized, in particular, especially in the north, in the west. In the south, they were more Byzantine influenced. But in any case, they tendentially, even when under Magyar lordship, they tended to culturally gravitate around the more sanitary civilization, as they were a sanitary civilization themselves. Now, this consolidation, in any case, allowed the Magyars to establish a base from which they could project power across neighboring territories, adapting their semi-nomadic practices of herding and seasonal movements along river valleys like the Danube, Tisza, Maros, Kuros, and Temes, as later described by Byzantine Emperor Constantine Porphyrogenitus in his mid-10th century work De Administrando Imperio. There's an incredibly precious source it's an encyclopedical description of all the various peoples that, among the various things, that there is also a lot about the courtly rituals of the institutions of the empire, etc. But we know, for example, a lot about the Serbs and the relations with also peoples like the Magyars, because at some point they cross properly into the Pannonian steppe from the north, from Sorabia, across the territories. At the time, it is a bit before held by the Avars, but that sort of offers really a lot of insight, in fact, on this properly the relations between these various groups in this less stable part of Europe. We also made a video about Constantine Porphyrogenitus. We'll come back discussing this, and this Byzantine information is very precious. It it details the Magyar tribal structure, the division of their land, and that naturally was distributed among this ethnic oligarchs, right? And so you have an early affirmation of what will be the later Hungarian provincial repartitions. In fact, the geography of the same Hungarian lands under Gyula influence in the east. Early engagements revealed the flexibility of Magyar forces in forming temporary coalitions. In 811, they supported Bulgarian efforts against Byzantine armies in the Hemus Mountains, that would be the Balkan range, contributing to a significant setback for imperial forces during the reign of Emperor Nicephorus I. Right, so they had joined together with the Bulgarians in the habitual raids of the Balkans, where the Aegean valleys, the richer ones, the Mediterranean, together with the Bulgarians. Similar cooperative actions occurred around 839, when Magyar warriors assisted Bulgarian campaigns, again against internal Byzantine revolts along the lower Danube. Interestingly enough, what we were saying before, these raids were often activated by local strife, like the civil strife of the bigger civilization. So while the Byzantines were occupied at being each other and or were occupied on a distant frontier against, say, the Arabs, these peoples did also, we don't have much of the diplomatic evidence for this, but they would coordinate their force with far away countries. We know that a branch of the later Silk Road is probably already existed, but say it was reinforced in the later Middle Ages, would always maintain this deep connection again with the Caucasus, with Persia, with the Caspian Sea. So there was historically, and we know this from not just Magyar, but later Hungarian arms and armor, always this interesting Eastern bias, right? In part due also to the fact that the Hungarians kept absorbing different groups, war bands, tribes, etc., that came from the steppes. Think about all the refugees fleeing the Mongol invasions in the 12th and the 13th century. Now, by 860 or 861, interactions with Byzantine missionaries, including an encounter involving Saint Cyril, that is Constantine the philosopher, near Chersonesus in Crimea, during his mission to the Khazars, in fact, highlighted moments of restraint amid potential hostility as well. So the Magyars were already interested, obviously, in interacting with the broader civilizations. That was definitely the most remunerative thing to do in a way or another. Raids against East Slavic tribes became routine, by the way, with captives often sold at markets like Kerch to Byzantine buyers. As we've seen, that was a tradition. It existed far before the Nogai horde, and so it was just part of the local culture, so to say. In 862, Magyar groups entered the Carpathian Basin at the request of Moravian leaders to strike against East Frankish positions, marking an initial probe into the region. As we remember, further involvement came in 881, when Magyar and Kabar contingents clashed with East Frankish troops into separate engagements near Vienna, then part of the East Frankish marches, and possibly Kolmitz. This is interesting because you have Khazars that had admittedly at this point joined the Magyars, but not necessarily even just as a single sub-tribal group, right? But also as simple errant war bands, right? And so remember also from our series about 17th century warfare how quick the distance across the steppe in particular was from, say, the Volga to Vienna. All right, it wasn't such a strange thing. There would always be at that time mobilized by the Ottomans hordes of Tatars that swarmed across this de facto steppe corridors, right, either north or south of the Carpathians. Naturally, you know what is happening in the west. The Carolingian Empire is on its last legs in a broader universally controllable sense. The 892 campaign saw Magyar warriors join Eastern Frankish King Arnulf against Great Moravia. This is also fascinating because obviously the Franks were already hiring some of their war bands as well. The Moravians, the Great Moravia in particular, was, regardless of, again, the debate of whether it was actually further south in Serbia or was probably the one of today's Moravia, was in this case what we know as the West Slavic state centered in modern Czech and Slovak territories under rulers like Rastislav and Svatopluk I, which had emerged in the early 9th century as a powerful entity influenced by Byzantine missionaries, Cyril and Methodius, who introduced the Glagolitic alphabet and Old Church Slavonic liturgy. There, before tensions with the Frankish clergy led to shifts toward Latin rites, and in fact are redrawing probably in part accomplished the Magyar settlement, telling the truth, towards a more Western orientation, because another aspect that we say it's important to conceptualize in general is the fact that the Magyar settlement de facto severed for good the Western Slavs from the Yugoslavs. Right? If it hadn't been properly a Magyar power, again, like the ours had been before, there would have been a broader Slavic, de facto Slavic continuum, right, up to the Balkans from Central Europe. And movements had always existed with this migration of the Serbs, as we were recounting before. This obviously posits the Magyars as valuable auxiliaries in these regional wars. We have representations of 9th century Carolingian manuscript illuminations of horse archers, right? Quite well, neatly depicted. Of course, the Avars had a lasting impression on the Franks. The legend of the Huns, etc., like were there, but again, there hadn't been probably an end to the movements of this horse archers, of these nomadic raiders all across these territories. The territory was really ideal for that kind of warfare, hit and run tactics, raid, and so on. The Franks had needed to find the Bulgarians with such auxiliaries, and in fact, the Bulgarians fought in relatively similar ways. Alliances shifted rapidly as well. Everything was incredibly fluid until the Magyars settled in the Pannonian steppe. In 894, the Magyars partnered with Moravian ruler Svatopluk to attack East Frankish Pannonia, so they changed side. This had been, as we were saying before, the Roman-era province roughly corresponding to Western Hungary and parts of Austria today, while simultaneously aiding Byzantine forces against the Bulgarian Tsar Simeon I. And so you have a more typical alignment intentionally what the Magyars will essentially stick to in the later centuries. A Magyar army under Leontika, Arpad's son, crossed the Danube via Byzantine ships and defeated Bulgarian troops in 3 battles near the river, at Silistra, that is Durostorum. We are in basically the delta of the Danube, and also close to Preslav, that was the same Bulgarian capital, modeled after Constantinople to the degree that eventually went in ruin after the fall of the First Bulgarian Empire, forcing Simeon to retreat. These victories underscore the effectiveness of coordinated strikes across river barriers. The amphibious warfare of the Magyars is also fascinating because, as you've seen, they had been dwelling in pretty sort of marshy riverine frontiers, and so the use of naval support to outmaneuver land-based opponents was crucial. It wasn't just about horse riding, right? And consider, again, there are the Vikings around in the bigger picture, the Saracens as well, that were also other sailors in their own right. However, Bulgarian retaliation through Pecheneg alliances in 895 compelled the Magyars to withdraw westward. This is what actually pushes them, or at least, compounded their general decision to move. The Pechenegs naturally were pushing from the east, and they would largely remain there, right? Even though they did some similar to the Magyars, they were often hired as mercenaries by the Byzantines, as well as they plundered their lands. They were, in this sense, involved with the Bulgarians in dual ways, etc. Besides, by moving westwards, because some of these Magyar warbands eventually entered properly the Carpathian Basin, that was in theory, and in practice to an extent at least, occupied or at least controlled in a decentralized way by the Bulgarians. They overcame some Bulgarian resistance there. We are in southern Transylvania, and the lands beyond the Tisza as well, in the west. The Tisza is that river that basically is a tributary of the Danube that runs parallel, right, but to the Danube and the Carpathians, right in between them. And at that point, the Magyars effectively end Bulgar influence in the basin. That corridor had, as you know, been historically occupied by the Yazygas in antiquity. It was between Dacians and the Romans. It had been occupied by, it was essentially the frontier between the Gepids and the Longobards in the later 6th century. So it was properly steppe, and there are lots of cemeteries of graves properly that allow for properly the material documentation of the various steppe peoples that dwelt there. So the Magyars installed themselves there too. By 896, they had firmly occupied the Carpathian Basin under Arpad's overall command, with initial settlements concentrated on the plains, however, also garrisoning some sort of uphill avamposts. Right, this is really relevant because they can control the Carpathian passes as well. Explaining how this was done politically territorially is very complex. Here we're just drawing a basic military history. But as we've seen, the Magyars were not just nomads. Obviously, also in the steppes, there was infantry, there was a general encastellation capacity. So this is what gradually happens there too. Naturally, Transylvania, even though it will, as you know, be part of the kingdom of Hungary proper, not a crown land possession only outside of the kingdom, will remain, however, always autonomous to a degree. And so in many ways, it was just a way to handle, especially like the tolls, like maintaining a general transit and control resources there. It remained a frontier area. It's because the Bulgarians did not like what had happened there. This phase involved systematic advances rather than mere plunder, because you never destroy the place where you want to settle in. This phase involves the immediate testing of western frontiers that were naturally richer. You can imagine the Magyar warriors' fantasies being hyper excited by the idea of, in fact, how rich plunder would have been compared to those sort of Central European, Balkan, Eastern European territories that were naturally much poorer. And this is evidenced by the defeat of Berengar of Friuli's Italic army at the Brenta River by the Magyars in 899. right? The engagement featured classic steppe tactics. The Magyars drew the larger Italic force into pursuit before turning to envelop and destroy it, resulting in heavy Italic losses and subsequent pillaging of cities like Treviso, Vicenza, Verona, Brescia, Bergamo, and even Milan. This was striking. There was a follow-up incursion into Italy occurring in 901, followed by the 902 campaign that eliminated the eastern remnants of Great Moravia, already weakened by internal strife and prior Magyar-Frankish interventions, as we've seen, compelling surrounding Slavs to pay tribute. But the Italic case is the most striking because so this is a phase in which the Italic kingdom is split, as we were saying, this is typical for the post-Carolingian kingdoms, into different provincial powers that at some point claim properly the Italic crown. They could wear it at some point. There are also emperors that are named, literally, and Berengar is stemming from the northeastern provincial boundary. And that area had been historically the so-called Austria of the Longobards. So Austria, not the county of Austria, but say the eastern land, a bit like Austrasia for the Franks. In fact, the Carolingian and Longobard West was known as Neustria in the same identical name. And the case of the Longobards here is Lombardy itself. And Austria had always been a more militarized land of frontier that secured the eastern side of the Longobard, now Italic kingdom. The Avars had already launched raids into northeastern Italy. They had come to plunder different parts, but in general, they could not simply conquer, right? Maintain territory, whatever. They would plunder. They do something very similar to what the Magyars really do here. The battle against Berengar is quite famous. At some point, we'll make of it because it's fairly well documented, right? Historically, and we can properly appreciate all the various maneuvers and how the Magyars used some ruses, some tactics that perfectly make sense in absolute sense, exploiting their agility, etc. They're partly, like every victory anywhere is always also based on luck, but the Italics get properly ambushed and taken by surprise and annihilated in this sense. This is a very heavy blow to Berengar's reputation in Italy as well. The action against Great Moravia also shows that the days of autonomous Western and Southern Slavic powers across also the territory, in fact, the same Magyars had occupied, were over, and basically posits the Moravians, the Czechs, in part to under tribute, under Magyar subjection. These operations secured the Pannonian Basin's approaches and generated resources that funded further expeditions. Consider the years here. It's like the Carolingian Empire is over from a generation, basically. It's not, as you see here, that there aren't forces or there aren't sort of capacity even to cope with the Magyars, but the political weakness translated in military defeat is evident. Throughout the 10th century, Magyar forces thus conducted near-annual campaigns against Western Christian realms and Byzantine territories as well. Right? You want to appreciate how repetitive this really was. It's almost like what the Carolingians used to do, where in Frankish accounts you would find priests saying things like, this year there wasn't an expedition, meaning that it was news that there wasn't an expedition, or multiple ones every year. And the Magyars do pretty much the same thing, showing that even this system fueled itself, like the plunder rewarded the Magyars would fund further invest in these expeditions. As you understand, it might seem unsustainable. It basically lasts for half a century, so a couple of generations, but it's really continuous and it causes great damage. We can't assess how much Hungarian development owes to this kind of plunder, because we're talking about the first half of the 10th century. You can't really sort of shift wealth of a continent. This is not a thing. But in the moment, even the various elites in their provincial abodes in the Pannonian Basin are reinforced in their position by these activities. It would be also interesting to know how they really planned this, how they acted in concert with one another, how much competition was actually between the various clans for sort of the Grand Principality to achieve a lasting success, to rise politically over the opponents. In 905, a temporary alliance with Berengar of Italy provided 15 years of respite from Italic incursions, interestingly enough, allowing focus elsewhere. Between 907 and 910, three major East Frankish armies suffered crushing defeats. So this is the moment in which the Magyars turn to Germany. That will be the greatest target, right, of their incursions. This is fascinating because the second invaders, Vikings, Magyars, Saracens, actually struck all of the four majors post-Carolingian kingdoms, but essentially the Norse strike more in Gaul, the Saracens strike more in Italy, and the Magyars strike more in Germany. But all of them actually reach all of three of them. Like even the Saracens crossed the Alps. They entered in the Rhineland from the south to plunder at a point. So for telling you how fluid, like porous, the various boundaries and frontiers really were, right? And how also geopolitics, frankly, does not exist in the sense that it's all politics, and that's what makes it happen. Now, one might rightly wonder why the Eastern Frankish Kingdom in particular. Of course, we just said that geopolitics does not exist. Obviously, the fact that there was a broader Central European dimension, which is not much in fact a geographical dimension, but a broader social-cultural one, does help vehiculating this. Of course, like Germany, in particular in the post-Roman part, was substantially more advanced than most of the rest of what will be known as Central Europe for different reasons, but still there were some major advantages in spreading in an area that was in fact among the various post-Carolingian kingdoms as politically weaker, right? The Eastern Frankish kingdom was the less stable, the less sort of infrastructurally served, the more fluid, like it's not like it lacked potential, as in fact we will find out in a couple of generations, as it will actually be the center of the empire. But in this sense was actually the more primitive, the less, at this point in particular, the less defensible in a unitary direction that the Magyars paradoxically will contribute to create. Probably at some point the Magyars even crossed Germany to plunder the richer Sand Valley, right, in Western Frankishness, but it doesn't happen so often. Equally, they will come back to Italy at some point. They will pass through southern Gaul, even northern Spain. They will reach southern Italy as well. As we've seen, they reached the Balkans. They infested the Byzantine Empire, but at large, right, these places were a bit more difficult and complicated to plunder, or at least they were more distant. First of all, they tended to be more fortified, more urbanized. And so it wasn't that there would be episodic raids, but they wouldn't be so overly frequent. The place where mostly you see the hardest hit is Germany. And part of the reason is that the Western Slavs, as we've seen before, had been fighting against the Eastern Franks. At some point, the Magyars had even supported them. Admittedly, yes, they had even supported the Eastern Franks against the Slavs. But once they settled themselves in the Pannonian Basin, making leverage on the Western Slavs to properly even choke the entry point. I mean, the Eastern Franks wouldn't properly launch any major offensive against the Magyar lands until sort of much later in time. So, as we'll see now, the beginnings target mostly the Ostmark, that some parts of Austria that at some point had been controlled by the Eastern Franks, by the Bavarians, but were lost to the Magyars and reconquered by in fact the Germans once again. This obviously with local populations more or less remaining the same. All right, we have most famously the 907 Battle of Pressburg, Brezalaspurg, modern Bratislava. It's obvious that the Danube plays an important role in this. Like even upriver, the Magyars can proceed, like finding even the richest places to plunder. There they annihilate, in fact, a Bavarian-led invasion force under Luitpold that had pushed as far as that to counter the Magyars, with the deaths of the Margrave himself, Archbishop Dietmar of Salzburg. Salzburg had been crucial as ecclesiastical see, probably in the evangelization of the Western Slavs and attemptively at least whatever laid east, so the Avars, now the Magyars, and numerous counts and bishops opening, we could say Germany, France, and Italy, say the eastern and western Frankish kingdoms and the Italic one, to subsequent raids and securing the western approaches after the full conquest. This is a bath of blood of Bavarian nobility in particular that creates a massive damage to the entire structure. Like, as we were saying at the beginning, the eastern provinces of the Eastern Frankish Kingdom did risk to be chronically destabilized by the Magyars, right? This was a realistic scenario. Like, the idea that Saxony, Thuringia, Bavaria at some point as political districts would collapse, right? It wouldn't be able to sort of reorganize some stronger sort of provincial push. Instead, actually, like from Saxony and also Bavaria was in any case particularly developed. There would be an important coming back, because we'll see it better later, but as you know, historiography influences things a lot. When the Ottonians, probably Otto I, wins at Lechfeld, there is all a imperial later that will fall. It's already imperial because he's declared imperator proper by the troops, but probably imperial Saxon historiography that will magnify this victory, even more than the one of Otto's father Henry the Fowler at Riade that we've seen in some depth. It was really a big thing, and if you think about it, it really kind of happened after a generation here in 933. But so the Saxons would normally celebrate themselves, but a bit the unsung heroes of this story are the Bavarians, because they were the guys who actually withstood, like in the first row, so it's in the first line, the Magyar onslaught, and had contributed to probably attrition them, to beat them in multiple occasions. But since there wasn't an imperial Bavarian sort of historiography, propaganda, etc., like we hear of them less. As you know, the Ottonians will rule in a branch, probably in Bavaria, but this also did not quite help because they were normally sort of competitive with one another. At the end, probably at the beginning of the 11th century, you have Henry II, the quarrelsome, that becomes Holy Roman Emperor. It was of the Bavarian branch after the death of his nephew Otto III. But in this sense, there was in fact much of a commonality between southern and northern Germans, would always sort of dislike one another throughout the Middle Ages and beyond. And Bavaria, again, was the most developed place to begin with in Germany at the time, whereas Saxony was actually the least developed, but at the same time more successful at this age, militarily, imperially speaking. In 908, you have a Magyar victory at Eisenach in Thuringia, so we are probably in the heart of Germany. On August the 3rd, so towards the close of the season, which eliminated Duke Burkhard, the Duke Egino, and Bishop Rudolf of Würzburg, followed by plundering that extended to Bremen, so in probably the north, and in places that were targeted by the Vikings as well, in the North Sea. The 910 engagements culminated in the first battle of Augsburg, or Lechfeld, on June the 12th, where Magyar feign retreats lured Count Gottsberg's Alemannian troops into ambush. You have also the subsequent Battle of Rednitz on June the 22nd. The Magyars overwhelmed a combined Franconian, Lotharingian, and Bavarian army, slaying Duke Gebhard and Count Ludger. So this is a major issue, because basically all the single German stem duchies are beaten by the Magyars, and this tells you how unprepared the Eastern Frankish Kingdom was to this onslaught, how in disarray they were politically, how they could not form a coherent front against the Magyars. If these forces had been united, the Magyars would have not stood a chance. When in fact it happens, they fail, right? They would have actually confronted the Eastern Franks, but it would be defeated. Here, it's likely the stem duchies thought, let's just try single-handed. As you understand here, especially after the first defeats, there is a greater coalition. This fails as well, because overall the kingdom is fractured, and it's going on pretty difficult times in general. We have to make more videos about the first half of the 10th century in all these countries, but I have a video on William the Fowler that at least tells you what was to happen down the line here in a decade or so. These Magyar triumphs compelled Louis the Child, that was the last Carolingian ruler of East Francia, to agree to tribute, fixing temporary borders along the Enns River and demonstrating the Magyars' capacity to exploit divided opponents that could not but sort of essentially pay them just to make them go away. But it wouldn't end there, obviously. Smaller Magyar detachments penetrated deep into Frankish lands, reaching Bremen in 915, ravaging Saxony, Lotharingia, and West Francia itself in 919 after Conrad I's death. The country is, you see here, temporary power vacuum. The Magyars exploit that, and they cross the entirety of East Francia. They reach the west. So a pretty delicate situation, and one which you would normally freak out, because for how sort of complacent some of the various dukes were towards these raids, like saying, okay, cross my lands and we will not attack you as long as you don't plunder either. Still, this is not an optimal condition. It shows, this is in fact a moment of great weakness in general, because with the extinction of the Carolingian line, with the rise of different pretenders, everything becomes much more fragmented, and it's difficult to find a single ruler that can effectively hold the reins of the entire realm. In 921, Dorschatz and Bogath led forces that crushed Italic supporters of Rudolf II of Burgundy near Verona before advancing into Apulia. So they come back to Italy, they create a vogue, they beat this king that at that point the Italics were divided as usual, supporting this or that ruler, either local or even external, like in this case. The Magyars have even the confidence of properly, going down the boot, the Apennine Peninsula, so knowing that they would come back, and all around there is sea. So this is a pretty clear indicator that they thought they knew how to extricate themselves from it, passing through the northern territories, but also somehow dangerous. All these incursions were bold, right? So they basically gambled all the time, but they were also successful. Campaigns from, there would be, again, occasional incidents where, again, they were ambushed as they were coming back. They would lose part of the plunder. So there isn't a univocal, everything goes well, right? Everything is difficult here. And it's more like the general disorder of Europe at this point, rather than sort of just Magyar ability that causes this. Campaigns from 917 to 925 traversed Basel, Alsace, Burgundy, Provence, and the Pyrenees, while 926 saw armies ravage Swabia and Alsace, pass through Luxembourg, and touch the Atlantic coast. The 927 expedition, prompted by papal appeals amid Italic instability, marched into Rome itself and imposed tribute on Tuscany and Taranto. This shows how the Magyars were understood even as sort of temporary power wielders on behalf of same sort of more advanced powers here. Again, it's not like they could have simply occupied these places or controlled them, or sort of even being recognized as the overlords of the same, but they were useful forces for maintaining power. There are interesting similarities. For example, if you look at the famous Neapolitan Civil War in the mid-14th century, like you have at that point Hungarian forces that were mostly foreign mercenaries down in the streets, but still like entering Italy, like doing what they had to do. Also, they had horse archers among them, and at some point actually getting beaten, and or sort of beating the same locals, but telling the truth, with more conventional ways of war than we think. We'll make videos about that. This is another story. Consider that the Magyars are not Christian yet, so the fact that the Pope himself would sort of manage to establish some cooperation with them is fascinating. In 933, after the Saxon truce expired, a Magyar army invaded Saxony to collect the tribute that had been paid up to that time. You know what happens at this point. They encounter Henry the Fowler, that is the new king, and he defeats them at Merseburg. This is interesting because because Saxony had already become sort of the center of power by this point, and the Magyars, as soon as the tribute is not paid, they show up in between Thuringia and Saxony. So they immediately arrive at your door to ask to do, but they get defeated, right? And as we've seen in the video about the Battle of Reade, there is because this was actually fought in two different locations, and there is this both strategic and tactical surprise. In any case, the Saxons managed to not just put together enough Eastern Frankish forces to take on the Magyars in open field, but they also employ much more conventional, properly heavy cavalry tactics as well. And it shows that, in fact, warfare is not merely a matter of what kind of tactics do you use. Not even that the notion that this lighter tactics of the Magyars were, in fact, the better ones at all. Reade is a really important blow to Magyar understanding of Germany. They realize it's dangerous to go there, and it's not like before. Something is changing in the country, and they have probably been stretching the court too much. However, this is not the end of the raids in the region. Raids continued in Upper Burgundy in 935 and Saxony in 936. So there's probably a problem not just to cover the entire territory, but to replicate political success of bringing together different parts of the country again against the Magyars. The extensive 937 operation struck France as far as Reims, Lotharingia, Swabia, Franconia, and Burgundy, while also reaching Otranto in southern Italy, probably the heel of the boot, and approaching Constantinople's walls, securing 15 years of Byzantine payments. So as you understand, there is nothing really territorial about this in any permanent fashion. It's just, knocking at these people's door and exacting tribute, sort of complicating local politics that here we're not even addressing. Like if you study what is actually happening locally, it's not even that disaster you may think. There is actually a coherent mechanism where, again, the Magyars are more or less let operate in certain circumstances. For example, here we see the Otranto being a Byzantine possession, and in this sense being more like attack on the Byzantines, even though there had been plunder across the Apennine Peninsula as well. Further actions included repeated incursions in Saxony in 938, ravaging near Rome in 940, and the 940 raid into Spain at Hugh of Italy's behest, however. Right, so once again, you want to cross into Spain, okay, we'll give you safe conduct across Italy, as long as you get the hell out of the way quickly. And in fact, there were some ways to probably negotiate whether the Magyars would plunder or not. After all, it was easier for them to accept tribute rather than to risk open confrontation. Also, just imagine how Europe was in the 10th century. Like how can you stop like a horde of horsemen, like especially if they are not immediately carrying out the structures? They're like, but what's the point of even engaging with them? Right? It makes sense from multiple standpoints. After crossing into Catalonia, the Magyars besieged Lerida for 8 days, captured Yahya ibn Muhammad ibn al-Tawil at Barbastro. So they struck the Muslims too and held him for ransom before withdrawing due to logistical strains in arid terrain, and especially, going as far as the Spanish hinterland. You want to appreciate the logistics of this. It's obvious that the Magyars were sustaining themselves along the way, foraging most of their horses. They had to be pretty careful about that. So they would consume something, but in general, they were swift, so they wouldn't overly sort of burden in a sort of, unless they did really plunder the local sort of agricultural resources. They would create damage, but as long as they got the hell out of the way, in fact, they were allowed to pass in certain circumstances, explicitly or implicitly. In 947, Bulciu directed a southern Italian campaign under Taxoni, besieging Larino and occupying Apulia for 3 months, forcing Berengar II to purchase peace. These operations, spanning from the Iberian Peninsula to the Black Sea, illustrated the Magyars' logistical reach, often sustained by captured supplies and local levies, while avoiding prolonged sieges. In particular, fortified centers where their strengths in open maneuver offered less advantage. Right? And that's also why you understand why they preferred the Eastern Frankish kingdom. There was probably less fortifications around. The society was just more rurally based, so resources were more directly at hand, right? It's not like there weren't important cities also from the Roman past, or that there weren't castles. If you look at the Ottonian era army organization, roughly the 10th century, you realize that there are lots of very interesting things going on, aimed also, in fact, at local self-defense in many ways. The rise of the ministeriales partially passed through this. In any case, the Magyar Principality's internal organization still reflected its origins in a tribal alliance. Power initially was divided between the candidate, was the sacred nominal leader with spiritual and diplomatic authority held by Kurshan until his death in 904, and the Gyula was instead the military commander directing warfare and justice, though this dual Khazar influence arrangement waned after Kurshan's death, because in general there was a normal sort of alignment of the military and spiritual authority to begin with. Arpad assumed overarching leadership, with subsequent princes like Falici and Taxoni introducing quote-unquote reforms, including invitations to Christian missionaries and the construction of forts. So there is an evidently sort of interested attitude towards the benefits of civilization, of a more permanent territorial control, some more international political connection. Taxoni relocated centers from the Upper Tisza to sites like Saikesh, Fehérvár, and Esztergom, reorganized weaponry, and promoted large-scale resettlements of populations. These were all very important mechanisms to properly concentrate power, to shift, in particular, the course towards sort of, more readily accessible resources, better controlling the local peasantry, storing more weapons for sort of functionalizing the logistics, like for the expeditions. By Gedza's time, he reigned approximately between 972 and 997. Ties with the Bavarian court strengthened through, naturally, we'll understand now what happened in between, but they had already been beaten, in fact, by the Saxons, and so you have marriages, diplomatic exchanges. There was a obvious imitation of the German models at that point. Hungary remained strongly influenced by the Byzantine Empire, but the major influence came definitely from places like Germany, Italy. You have at the 973 Imperial Assembly under Otto I, this Magyar presence facilitating the spread of Christianity, while Gedza pragmatically balanced also the pre-Christian traditions as well, because that was mostly a way of saying, okay, if you stick to that, you're basically countering the monarchic attempts at power concentration and broader international integration. The Magyar oligarchs in many ways were pursuing parallel efforts, like in territorial stabilization, also through Christianization, but at large. Like they made it a point. Like it had happened so many other times with religion as an expedient rather than an actual theological. But indeed, there were some deep beliefs that also in the older religion, that there was all still at this point surely a massive regional old Magyar set of traditions, of rules, and this lived into later medieval Hungary. Like, they didn't disappear overnight. They came to be part of the local identity, folklore, and so on. The same language keeps them alive in part. The Magyar society transitioned from ranked chiefdoms to a more homogeneous system, merging with local Slavic populations, even though the Magyar language will remain prevalent, and developing village systems alongside fortified noble seats. Military practices, as we know, emphasize highly mobile light cavalry capable of rapid strikes and withdrawals. Warriors typically carried composite bows for harassment, sabers for close combat, and minimal armor to preserve speed. We described their tactics again that are basically the ones of any other steppe people at this point. There isn't really a difference. There are some differences, especially when you evaluate not just different, of course, basins that have slightly different influences in material culture and so on, but also mostly at the waves of the steppes that occur at different times, generations of centuries between one another. When pressed, the Magyars employed feint retreats to disorder enemy formations, or to lure them, right, to eventually counterattack the isolated units. But the truth is that if they did so, it's probably because they couldn't hold ground against them. And this was typical against heavier Western cavalry that also inflicted heavy losses on them, prompting, in fact, a shift probably in their military style on the longer run, right? Never underestimate infantry in this sense, not just because, say, battles like Riade or Lechfeld witnessed Eastern Frankish victories through the use of sanitary forces. Cavalry and infantry had been the same among the Burgundians or the Longobards. But now also the Magyars used more infantry in general. They were also minimally skilled in, or even not even minimally, in siege warfare, for example. But they simply, from a political and strategical point of view, did not really need to be even that on the at the throat of major centers of civilization. They could simply counter-strike and sort of inflict disproportionate losses for Magyar sustainability. After all, being out there in the Western steppe, surrounded by different Slavic tributary groups, like you don't even have this immediate threat from so many different places. It's a bit like what happened, I think, the Habsburgs in the 16th century. Part of the reason, we made an entire video about this, why they also took it relatively easily. There was obviously less resource there than in other places, but also there weren't big enemies quite literally next door. I mean, even if the Ottoman Empire could besiege Vienna, still that was a massive stretch for the Turks. And so the Magyars enjoyed this position. The Magyar tactics proved effective against heavier Frankish and Byzantine armies, such as what we have seen in the Brenta ambush of 899 and the multi-day maneuvers at Augsburg in 910. Intelligence played a critical role with reconnaissance units, as we've seen, scouting, creating probably a corona right around the army, right? Being very wary of ambushes. This is something that they brought themselves as a reflex from the steppe, but it was quite well adapted, of course, to enemies, again, like the Franks. They probably recognized enemy strengths, terrain, weeks or months in advance, right? And there was all a know-how that unfortunately is lost. Obviously, the sources do not talk much about this, but there is all, in fact, a dimension of the scale of warfare. There's not merely the Magyars spawn out of nowhere. Like, people knew essentially when these expeditions were starting, or they had an idea. There were informants pretty much everywhere. There were merchants and so on. This is true for everybody, for the Saracens, for the Vikings. People knew, right, what was going on, right? This was shown in the 898 Italian probe. By the way, lots of people also knew about each other on a regular basis, right? Especially like in a sanitary context, people knew, like, through the itineraria that were essentially, in the large absence of proper maps, the way to say, how do I go to a place to another? How do I move an army from a city to another? And there were all these various stations and everything was dotted also in a way that would be facilitating logistics as well. Obviously, if you were an invading army, you wouldn't receive that, if not by force, right? But the settlement patterns, the fortified centers, everything followed, as we've seen in videos about seigneurial Europe, a pattern of functional support, especially with heavy cavalry. Think about the Faldrum, how reserves were deeply important probably in seigneurial economy and also for the safety of everybody who wanted to take refuge into their castles when these marauders arrived, right? And Magyar hosts could be sizable. We will make more videos about this in particular. You had also psychological factors, including terror through rapid appearances, at least in the moment, right? Because at least this reconnaissance parties could also be dispersed, but the point was also this, like, if you have to chase them, you may also lose some forces doing so, in the sense that if you want to maintain the bulk of your forces intact to strike at the enemy core, you also have sort of to let these raiders run relatively free, because if they're all scattered across the territory, light cavalry does not have a battle order, that they're fighting, they're spreading in a loose fashion. How do you even chase them technically? I mean, there were actual lighter cavalry units also, of course, among the Franks, the Italics, and so on. They knew how to do that, but still, overall, right, it was easier for them to shut themselves inside their castles and cities with cattle, everything, like all the peasantry that could be taken in. And this is how it had been happening for quite a long time. It was like just the habitual practice of warfare. The Longobards had done that with the Franks at the time of Charlemagne himself. And as we've seen, the Magyars can't quite storm many places at all. Naturally, there were lots of places that they stormed that were normally smaller emplacements. Mostly, there is this sense of savagery that obviously is inherent in peoples coming from the steppes in general, especially the lighter elements. Where often we say the Magyars, but who actually were those people? Because as we've seen in steppe warfare, the lighter element comes sometimes from nowhere. There wouldn't be anything surprising if we would see even seasonal warriors that came, even maybe from Central Asia at some point, to carry out these raids for a while, maybe for years. I mean, if they had come so far at this point. But the actual Magyar ethnic core was the one of the establishment, the one of the nobility, of the heavier cavalry. It's completely normal in the reason why in the steppe that there is an elite, right? And all the rest is basically naked, sort of horse archers without armor or anything. It's that the latter are actually the product of subjugated, destroyed peoples that now just are obliged to follow as dogs, really, that they're masters. And these people are, you can just imagine the level of sort of ethnic mix that existed there as well. And these people were the angriest, sort of the most frustrated with information, and they were just really bloodthirsty. That was their moment. They didn't even need a discipline, right? They were just unleashed, and they would lay waste some place. Of course, there was all a technicality. They were brought to obey. So forage is different from destruction, etc. But in general, like the anthropic types would have, if we can't talk about anthropic here, it would have really struck you for the savagery and the brutality of the same. Otherwise, the elite was also, as always, more international and relatively more cultivated, even though surely they had some lifestyle that would have horrified, and did indeed horrify the rest of the West. So some captives were sacrificed. It was done routinely also to spread terror, but there were some religious elements to this. This happened also among the Norse, among the Saracens. There was all a level of, indeed, religious dimension in this. And the idea of clash of faith, really, especially in this case, like the Magyars are an external group, right? They were related to different groups that eventually can sort of have straddled the Urals or can be considered European. But in general, they were really something new, something exotic, right? And so this scared, obviously. If you look at the biblical prophecies and all the memories, think about the Nibelungen, the idea of the Huns of Attila at Vienna. And truly, at this point, the Magyars were there. They were the monsters. They were the evil ones. They were truly the ones come from the bowels of earth, from hell itself. Right? They surely earned this reputation. Despite successes, defeats occurred when, in fact, opponents adapted, such as Merseburg, as we've seen in 933, where Thuringen feigned flights misled Magyar pursuers into Saxon heavy cavalry charges, against which they couldn't quite do much. And in this sense, it's not like the Saxon heavy cavalry charges just struck like the horse archers. They could even chase them. It's not that. It can't be done. It's a myth that you can't, because it's still some relative type of formation, even though horse archers, yes, are in a loose formation, but if you group lots of them and they have to act in concert and with their volleys and all the worthless, this concentrated fire, you can't chase them, and you can't crush into them, because one thing is chasing one guy, and still it could be done. Even heavier knights could actually chase lighter guys. In also the psyche, the level of exhaustion of both horse and man, it really plays a role. But obviously, there was a Magyar heavy cavalry that clashed against the Saxons, was beaten. And in here, in fact, the most important clash that we will surely make a video on sooner or later is the 955 one in the campaign against Germany, representing a culmination of Western pressures as well. Bulxul, Lel, Schur, and Taxony led forces that plundered Bavaria and Swabia that year, burning monasteries before besieging Augsburg. Right? Monasteries were rich, in any case, the symbol of the local national unity. It's probably in these centers that probably the idea of a Teutonic kingdom had been forged in the last generations towards a more cohesive national mentality of otherwise sort of scattered provincial Germanic territories under influence of different civilizational axes, so to say. Otto I, as you know, the son of Henry the Fowler, son and successor of Henry the Fowler, assembled a unified army, including Bavarian and Swabian contingents themselves, that now were pretty angry, given what the Magyars had just done, and engaged, in fact, them on August the 10th at the Battle of Lechfeld, also known as the Second Battle of Augsburg. Initial Hungarian assaults met coordinated German countercharges, with Conrad of Lorraine's intervention stabilizing threatened sectors. We'll get into the depths of this again in the battle reconstruction, but remember that, and this is a very interesting aspect militarily and topologically, like we say, again, the Magyars are this is again the bias, that these are steppe peoples, and so they are the only ones that have a proficient cavalry sort of mobility or ruses or whatever. No, but probably you would have been surprised to see by the time of Lechfeld how similar even the Germans and the Magyars looked in a sense. Probably you would also be surprised by how different they looked still. There would always be differences along the centuries in spite of the ensuing Magyar westernization, true especially Germanization in Central Europe. But there is a sense that even the Eastern Franks, this was not a land where cavalry was even overwhelmingly pushing, right? It's not until the second half of the 12th century that Germany fully developed like a feudal system akin to the one of the neighboring West Francia, right? But you can easily see it from the migration era that the hero in all of these stories, for all these peoples in folklore, even among populations that did not make a great use of cavalry, is a horseman, right? And knowing how to fight, and especially at this point, the Eastern Frankish kingdom is, in any case, heading towards a vassalic beneficiary system that allows a consistent amount of cavalry. Hell, they are capable, and especially they are capable because they have fought against the Magyars themselves, and so they know their tricks, they know their ruses. There are very interesting ways to cope, for example, against horse archery. There is this trick of creating literally a shield wall on horseback to parry themselves from missiles closing in, because the thing was that, like, not remaining under the hail of arrows for too long and closing as quickly as possible, maintaining cohesion at the same time. It takes a hell of a lot of collective training to do that, right? Especially to maximize that German heavy cavalry element. So these battles, like Riad Lechfeld, are really extraordinary because they speak of a very advanced equestrian culture among, in this case, the Eastern Franks. The Magyars' disadvantage in prolonged close combat against armored opponents broke and fled, suffering approximately 5,000 casualties in the field and additional losses during pursuit. Especially after you've broken them on the field, it's not a matter of mobility, you're done for. You're in a completely different metaphysical dimension once properly the panic has struck on you, you're exhausted. There would be, like in all battles, people that literally simply let themselves getting killed because they just don't have any mean to do anything. Slaughtered like lambs. Captured leaders, including Bulksu, Lehel, and Sur, in fact, face execution in Regensburg on August the 15th. Regensburg had been the old Carolingian quote-unquote capital of East Francia and the capital of Bavaria in this sense, so from, in fact, which the first kings of Germany had ruled, and made multiple videos on Carolingian Germany, and Regensburg was thus like the Danube, the projection, the launch pad, the waterway to Hungary for probably descending, like just like the Ostsiedlung was doing autonomously at that point against Hungary, and there would be raids into it as well from the German side. And these leaders were treated as like they needed to die, they needed probably to be sacrificed to God because of the immense pain and suffering that they had caused to the local populations. This outcome halted major Western incursions. It's enormous in general for Western history. You have Otto eventually going over to Italy, and he becomes Holy Roman. And so there's the reconnection of Germany and Italy, the Renovatio Imperii, as a matter of fact. For the Magyars, it's really big. It's stunning. The moral scale, probably of the blow, the impact of how they interiorized the fact that had been beaten, by the way, in a spiritual, metaphysical, religious sense by somebody who evidently was stronger than them, who had the actual imperium. People cared deeply at the time about this. These people have the imperium. They have beaten you. This is a huge deal. Like, if you continue with sort of not wanting to understand this, you can lose everything. And this battle had been painful, bloody enough. So the Magyars basically rewired their entire political and strategical mindset. They evidently wanted to continue plundering in the West, but they realized they can't anymore. That if they are going to enter again in Germany, in Italy, they're going to be beaten away. Because this battle has also spirited the rest of Europe. Europe is growing, is recovering fast, quickly. So the Magyars decided to turn towards the Byzantine Empire that had not really been left alone because it was, yes, it was powerful and dangerous, but also because it was a bit less affluent, especially from the lands that the Magyars would have had to reach them from. There were the Bulgarians in between. The Balkans are a veritable nightmare. So it's not like the campaigns in the West had been easy, but they had been preferable because at least they were, generally speaking, richer places. And there was a richer concentration of wealth. And so they try initially to continue their habit. It's difficult all of a sudden after generations of yearly campaign. There had been Magyar leaders and rank and file horsemen that had been properly born into this mentality where this was completely like their entire identity, right? They try against the Byzantine Empire, Bulgaria in between, because the Magyars and the Bulgarians do not like each other at all. And in fact, I will make a series probably about the wars more in depth between them. You have Magyar forces reaching Thessaloniki in 968 and also participating in Sviatoslav of Kiev and Rus 970 campaign. I also recently made a a bit about this in the one effect of the Byzantine-Rus clashes. In this case, the raid ended at Arcadiopolis. The Magyar principality's development towards some medieval standard of statehood accelerated after these events. As we were recalling before, semi-nomadic transhumance gave way to settled agriculture, supported by river-based seasonal movements that transitioned into permanent villages. Archaeological evidence indicates early fortified sites such as Mazapurk, that is Zalavar, alongside pit dwellings and emerging multi-roomed structures. Naturally, there was much more of this scattered that we don't know of it. The Magyars always had some sort of early sedentary base, but many of them, most of them, had objectively kept living in the steppes, like very nomadic ways. Population integration blended Magyar clans with Slavic inhabitants, in particular fostering homogeneity. Constantine Porphyrogenitus describes Magyar lands in the mid-10th century, noting rivers were like the Thames, Maros, Kouros, and Tisza, with eastern regions more suited to nomadic practices. Centers shifted under Fajr and Taxony, who abolished all their Tisza-based seats in favor of western locations, as we've seen. Gedze's reign saw formal peace with Otto I in 973, baptism of his household, though he retained some pre-Christian elements privately. This was also completely normal. And invitations to missionaries like those from Passau. There was yet another very important, Passau is on the Danube, and it's basically the gateway to the Pannonian Plain, and so that was an important launching pad also for evangelization during the Aussiedlung. The first Benedictine monastery at Pannonhalma was founded in 996, symbolizing this important shift. I made a series about sort of the later medieval Hungarian history from the 11th century. So if you're interested, you can sort of start it from here. That's sort of the advantage of Schwerpunkt. You can always, at this point, fall on some other video that is inextricably connected. Stephen, this Voig baptized Stephen of unification efforts built on these foundations. After defeating Kompany, who claimed succession through traditional lines in a 997-998 internal strife, Stephen concentrated authority, suppressed remaining pre-Christian old houses, and established counties centered on noble castles. The coronation at Esztergom on Christmas of 1000 or 1001 by a crown linked to Pope Sylvester II, Gilbert of Aurillac, and Otto III of the Saxon house formalized the Christian kingdom, aligning Hungary with Western feudal models. Military reorganization incorporated heavier cavalry and better armored formations, diminishing reliance on pure light horse archers. We talk about reforms here and there. We're just trying to give an idea of what was happening. There weren't reforms as we intended. This was an incredibly gradual shift. There was never like a moment in which they simply decided, okay, we need simply heavier cavalry in general. For sure, they would have decided this at some point, producing or importing sort of greater lots of Western-style arms and armor. This was happening all across, by the way, Eastern Europe, as far as Kiev and beyond even, especially at this point still the German proper arms and metallurgic production from the Upper Rhine. But let's say the possibility of sustaining this heavier cavalry was tied to much bigger issues. It had to do with land distribution, political powers. The Hungarian army transformed itself very gradually, and you find, in fact, up to pretty late in time, things like, even 13th century Hungarian cavalry met with shorter stirrups, lighter cavalry in general. This transformation ensured survival amid neighboring powers that were also toughening up. you have Germany that is the greater problem. Then you have occasional clashes with the Venetians on the Dalmatian coast. You have this broader Slavic extended frontier subjects that will largely remain under your control. You have Poland of the Piasts that is reinforcing the Bohemians, the Moravians, the Czech dominance of the Przemyslids basically gets rid of most of Hungarian interference in their duchy that is gradually being absorbed, however, within not the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, but at least the Holy Roman Empire. As we were saying at the beginning, still at this point, it's possible for Hungary or even Poland to be part of the Holy Roman Empire. It's not the case. You have in the south heavy Byzantine influence. In the east, you have the steppes just across the Carpathians, different movements that you have always to control. There are the Pechenegs that create problems. So what is fascinating here is considering like the different scenarios, the theaters, or the enemies probably that the Magyars had to deal with. When you look, for example, at the relation with the Byzantine Empire, that gets a bit sort of overshadowed by the greater plunders in the Eastern Frankish Kingdom, but you realize that they went also beyond raids. And this was done from the Pannonian Plain, so not even from Bulgaria. There's still two that existed in between. For example, in 934, joint operations with the Pechenegs had captured Belgrade after defeating relieving forces. As you know, the hinterland was Slavic, but the Byzantines retained garrisons along the major, on the Danube in this case, and all the various fortifications that historically had been quite a cornerstone there for the control of the middle Danube will remain historically. After they had plundered Thrace and they had encamped for 40 days near Constantinople, yielding ransom and tribute, the 943 alliance with the Kievan Rus secured another payment from Romanos I. Later incursions in 958 under Apor reached Constantinople's vicinity but ended in nighttime ambushes on return. This was always the risk, after all, also for sort of Rus as stratagem experts like the Magyars. By the way, there is all a continuity in the description of these peoples in Byzantine ethnographic history that mostly overlap, as you know, from Leo the Wise's accounts with the Avars. They were fighting literally in the same ways. There were slighter differences. I made some videos about the Eurasian steppes warfare on the basis of the aforementioned waves. And so there are slight differences in arms and armor, but de facto, like tactics are practically the same. The 961 campaign into Thrace and Macedonia suffered similar fates, by the way. Naturally, Thrace and Macedonia are from this side of the Balkans, and so it's all riskier, right? Just think about your supply lines being constantly threatened. At some point, they were aligned with the same Bulgarians, but you couldn't really trust too much. In fact, in 966, Magyar forces compelled Bulgarian Tsar Peter I to allow passage towards Byzantine lands. It wasn't merely participatory, it was also forced. In 968, the Magyar expedition split in groups, one capturing 500 Greeks near Thessaloniki with 300 men, while another lost 40 to an ambush. This fragmented way to plunder the various Balkan valleys towards the Aegean was really typical. You have an idea of the mess that these things really were, even for historiographic description, like it's between political fragmentation, rivalry between these two peoples, different war bands and chieftains doing whatever they wanted, sort of selecting probably different targets depending on the knowledge, pre-acquired knowledge of this or that Byzantine town, needing what to do afterward, coming back or losing, plundering again, becoming heavier, being ambushed on the way back, and by whom? By the Greeks, by the Bulgars. It was incredibly messy. The participation in Sviatoslav's 970 invasion concluded with the defeat at Arcadiopolis, we were saying before, under John Zimisces, closing the era of large-scale Balkan operations, admittedly. This is already after Lechfeld. In fact, these were attempts mostly to compensate for that defeat, right? The 961, it starts when Otto becomes emperor. There is so he enters Italy, etc. So at this point, the Magyars are doing something else. In 948, Bulscu and Termaxu Dormash visited Constantinople, where Bulscu received baptism and patrician rank from Constantine VII, who acted as godfather. This is important because, as you've seen, these guys were the defeated at Lechfeld, and yet they were already Christianized. Tactical development persisted even as settlement advanced. Warriors favored hit-and-run methods, avoiding direct assaults on walled cities lacking siege equipment. They could build locally, but carrying them during the raids was prohibitive. And in any case, wasting time was just really not suited. Cavalry, again, horses eat a disproportionate lot. You could simply destroy the countryside and just get the out of there, in the sense of habituating, as we've seen before, the local populations to even kind of tolerate part of this, at least not to the point of not going to an open field confrontation. When battle proved unavoidable, arrow barrages preceded charges by elite units equipped with lamellar armor and curved sabers. The elite we're talking about before. River crossings utilized inflated animal skins for flotation. This is stuff we've seen since the dawn of warfare, including the Assyrian armies. I made an entire video, at least about partially this Bayonid's military engineering means, if we can so call them. This enabled surprise attacks, as demonstrated, for example, against the Venetian lagoons, even in 900. So for telling you how they couldn't be simply stopped even by natural obstacles. Psychological warfare included sparing monks or envoys to recount discipline and ferocity as well, instructing them, go tell the others what you've seen. At St. Gallen in 926, this is what happened. Accounts described orderly conduct amid plunder as well. And this was inherently a political choice, depending on how they had to be received by the locals in the moment. These elements, combined with meticulous planning, such as choosing battlefields with ambush potential or luring enemies across obstacles like the Danube or Brenta, compounded the Magyar military abilities and capacities. And the Principality itself maintained diplomatic flexibility. There were alliances with Berengar of Italy in 905 and 947, securing mutual defense, even. Because there was all an interplay, in fact, again, between the West that has to do also with the two sides of the Alps. That is very interesting. You have payments from Henry the Fabler in 924 and 933 buying temporary peace. Different times, even on the same campaigns, eventually escalating in bloodbath. Contacts with Constantinople witness even these levels of evangelization. And you have these engagements facilitating intelligence and cultural exchanges, unavoidably influencing the gradual adoption of Christianity. By Geza's era, as we've seen, 12 Magyar envoys attended Otto I's 973 Diet. So imagine, by the way, after not even 20 years of Lechfeld, you have these hungers at the German Diet in their traditional custom, and they're all proud, and signaling thus integration into broader European networks. They were part of this political balance, right? Even if largely subordinated, at least as far as German affairs were concerned. And so you have all this gradual, albeit slow, civilization, settlement patterns evolving from tent encampments and pit dwellings to wooden and stone houses, with noble residences emerging in the late 10th century. Islamic geographers that often visited Hungary because it was full of sort of raw resources in quantity. There wasn't much, again, of crafts or sort of specialized crops or whatever, but in general, like, it was a big country, like, and Muslim geographers visiting noted tent usage among commoners. So the steppe influence is still very pronounced, with also excavations revealing multi-roomed structures by the 11th century at the same time. And so you have this this further organization of local levies, organization. Constantine Porphyrogenitus describing Eastern Hungarian settlement near the sort of 5 rivers under Gyula influence. It's difficult to summarize everything, sort of blurring how eventually things simply turned into sort of a stable feudal kingdom under Christianity and a general alignment with the papacy and everything. What is important here is that the legacy of these developments endured through the Arpad line, which ruled until 1301. The Principality's ability to adapt, blending steppe mobility with settled administration, ensured its persistence amid Viking, Arab, and Slavic pressures that fragmented other regions. Magyar warfare, initially defined by rapid strikes and tribute extraction, developed into a defensive system supporting a Christian state that influenced Central European politics for centuries, while maintaining always this, in politics, in warfare, these at times like an unequivocal steppe authoritarian traits that will characterize, in fact, Hungarian history for a very long time. I'm glad that we talk about the Magyars again, because, again, at the beginning I made some pretty consistent videos about them, but we haven't quite entered in the depths of their history. So this is still warfare, and this is, again, still a compendium on the Magyar way of war. That is the thing that, after all, sort of characterized them the most. We will see this better as time goes on, as we cover more sort of the lottery, so to say, content, all the various implications of it, like meaning politically what was going on, also with the Western Slavs, with the Bulgars, with the Kivans. So there is all a rich history. Obviously, the most important being the one with the West, with which they were inextricably connected since the 9th century. It could have been otherwise. But it's interesting, in fact, this range that will be maintained, in fact, by the Hungarian kingdom. It was more akin to an empire, telling the truth. All the crown lands were, per se, like just very, like really extensive territories across many different peoples at the same time. And yet, probably the Magyars find their place, in fact, in this system, and they are to influence European history in a deeply profound way that, in fact, we haven't quite too much emphasized. We need really more videos on Hungarian history. Yeah, we made, say, not an irrelevant amount of videos on it, but it always feels like it's too few, and indeed we can do much, much more. Here I distinguish Magyar from Hungarian in the playlist, so I hope it doesn't generate particular confusion. I tend to do it. Like, you don't have German history until I think the end of the Carolingian rule here. Before it's something else. The same goes for Italy. It's until the Longobards, it's not Italy, so to say. Even though it's not Italian, at least in the playlist. If we separate that, even with France, we begin with the time of Hugh Capet. So, speaking of French, even though they didn't call themselves as such at the time, you have to wait Philip II Augustus. But I hope it makes sense. I hope that we manage to bring together as much as we can about these peoples. And it's always interesting talking about not just the Magyars, but also the second invaders in general. We have to do more about the Vikings, even though, as I said, given that I recently made some new videos about medieval Scandinavia, and what we really need to talk about later, medieval Scandinavia. But the Vikings, too, are sort of made multiple videos on the Viking. There's even a playlist called probably the Viking era, but when you look at it, it's not really small per se, but it mostly talks about either general topics or something skirting around probably the depths of Viking history and warfare. So I don't know why we got to this point like this. It has to do with lottery/cycle for some reason. It can be argued that when you look at even Viking history, it may have been overrated in terms of overall historical relevance, and especially by pop culture. But in general, it's obvious you can't really tell the history of these centers without the Vikings, or however you want to call them, all right? And I think this channel has the merit of seeing there being the channel has been overly suggested in the last couple of weeks or even more at an unprecedented level. Like the level of suggestions has skyrocketed. And it's not entirely clear why this is the case. But if I make here a brief check, this has definitely been going up for quite a long time. And yeah, it may as well go down, but I was glad at least that we are experiencing some what seems to be organic, probably an upsurge of suggestions. I don't know what's going on. It may be, well, the algorithm, these things go up and down normally, but the fact that we're growing as a channel is deeply felt and understood. So it's becoming ever more organic, and we're really glad to have arrived at this point. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.